Hello and welcome. And thank you very much for joining us. Welcome from me, Michael Scott in Oxford in the United Kingdom, and from my joint convener, Sanford J. Ungar in Washington, D.C., to the 35th jointly promoted event between the Future of the Humanities Project and the Free Speech Project. The latter is sponsored by Georgetown University and the former by Georgetown's Humanities Initiative in association with Campion Hall, Oxford, and the Las Casas Institute for Social Justice, Blackfriars Hall, Oxford. Together, the two projects consider issues concerning human dignity, rights, cultures, histories, traditions, freedoms in a wide spectrum of educational activity, policy, expression, and aspiration. In a moment, I'll hand over to Sandy, who is the director of the Free Speech Project. He will introduce today's distinguished guests and moderate the ensuing discussion before I return to chair the question and answer session in about 40 minutes' time. From the start, you can type in questions to the panel by using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Please use the Q&A button and not the chat button. These will come to me during the session, and I will try and put them to the panel for consideration. We urge you to ask questions as and when they occur to you so that there's no bottleneck at the end. I hope you enjoy today's discussion. Over to you, Sandy.
Thanks very much, Mike. It's great to have hit number 35 in our series that started as a little experiment during the pandemic and almost 3 years now. Beautiful fall day in Washington, D.C., and a time of sadness about many things happening in the world. But our focus today is to talk about the current American spectacle and how people have reacted around the globe to some of the confusion in American politics and culture and some things that are happening here that, frankly, leave us ourselves incredulous sometimes, including recently. We have a very interesting and carefully selected panel today. Susan Eisenhower, a favorite and frequent guest on this series, is a policy analyst with a focus on national security, wide experience in the arms control field, and very knowledgeable about what's happening in the rest of the world and how others see Americans. Nirmal Ghosh has been a foreign correspondent for the Straits Times of Singapore since 1994. Most recently, in the last 7 years, perhaps it is, in Washington and covering the United States very ably for various Asian audiences. Michael Oborn is a fellow at Blackfriars Hall, but resident in Paris, and had a long career with the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD there, and has obviously had much to do with the cooperation of other countries with the United States. Richard Wyke is particularly well suited for this discussion today as the Director of Global Attitudes Research at the Pew Research Center here in Washington. He has done studies with his colleagues of how America is viewed around the world, and some very certainly reliable seeming polls. We might start with you, Richard. I saw that your latest poll in June, perhaps before some of the most recent catastrophes occurred, such as the disappearance of a speaker from the House of Representatives. But in June 23rd, there were fairly favorable attitudes internationally about President Biden, confidence in him, not overwhelming, but more than half the people in the countries you surveyed, and also in the United States. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about this and how it fits in the trend lines.
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks for having me as part of this discussion, Sandy. Yeah, at Pew, we've been doing these surveys on what people think around the world about the United States now for over 2 decades. And, we've seen a lot of changes over that time. If you get back to the George W. Bush era, we saw a rise in anti-Americanism, a lot of opposition to key elements of Bush's foreign policy, particularly the Iraq War. The numbers kind of rebounded a little bit during Obama's presidency, went back down again under Trump. And then again, we've seen, a return in terms of positive views of the United States in many countries under President Biden. There's a lot of things that we can talk about that explain, those changes and those ups and downs that we've seen. I think one of the sort of key themes to me is that when people see the United States and American foreign policy sort of acting cooperatively, engaging in multilateralism, working with other countries to solve global challenges, that tends to be the kind of thing that people react positively to. When they perceive that the United States is going it alone, or the United States is withdrawing from international commitments and things like that, that tends to lead to more negative numbers for the United States in our surveys. And one of the things that people reacted positively to, I think, when it comes to President Biden compared to his predecessor, is that they see him engaging in more multilateralist efforts or more international cooperation. And that's one of the things, at least, that's led to some more positive numbers over the past couple of years in terms of how people feel about the United States.
Thanks. Susan, from your perspective, a broad international perspective, what do you see happening, and how does it jibe with how Americans are feeling about their place in the world, as far as you can tell?
Well, it's an excellent question, and thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this distinguished panel. I think that there is concern given the recent tumult, not only in Russia and Ukraine, but also now in the Middle East, that there is concern about what America's position is going to be and whether we can be regarded as a reliable partner. I just met with a group 2 days ago who are from Eastern Europe, and they're deeply concerned that the events in the Middle East are now going to refocus our effort and attention in that part of the world, as opposed to the things that are underway in their part of the world. So I think it'll be very interesting, and I'm looking forward to hearing what Richard's research produces after we settle in on these really shocking events of Saturday onwards, because I think this is going to be really a time where people are looking again at how all the major actors are performing.
Nirmal, I think one of your particular focuses of attention during your extremely productive 7 years here in Washington has been to try to understand how Americans see themselves in the world and whether they care particularly about how others see them. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on board, and so good to be with all of you. Thank you. Yeah, I think basically the American sort of national security establishment view of its place in the world sees the whole world through the American lens, the American prism, right? And people like Senator Rubio and all are correct that an entire generation or two of Americans have grown up with America being the only superpower, hyperpower, if you will. And it is very difficult psychologically to understand and to accept, rather, the shift to a multipolar world. If you look at Southeast Asia, which the Straits Times, of course, being from Singapore, if you look at the Southeast Asia perspective, there was also very Pew's surveys make very interesting reading, but there was also a very interesting study by the Asia Society earlier this year. They had a closed-door session with officials and intellectuals from across ASEAN, and a couple of points emerged. One is that the US should not look at a region like ASEAN merely through the prism of US-China competition. And the other thing that emerged is that ASEAN in particular basically would like to have trade agreements and access to markets and so forth. That is not actually forthcoming from the US. There is a very large, very substantial U.S. reservoir of soft power in the region. Everybody likes the U.S. Everybody wants the U.S. to be present, notwithstanding the issues they have with the U.S. There are no illusions about the U.S. either. I mean, the Iraq invasion 2003 was obviously a huge turning point. And there is also a perception in that region, in Southeast Asia, that the U.S. is provoking China, and that the U.S. should should sort of hold back a bit on that, because that induces sympathy for China, because the people of that region and significant Chinese minorities across the region don't want to be put into that position.
Michael Oborn, you've spent years in Paris observing the interrelationships of Western economic powers and democracies, and how have the attitudes toward the United States evolved over that time, from your point of view, especially in Europe?
Well, thank you for inviting me to share these ideas with you and with this very distinguished panel, has been mentioned. It's difficult to speak on behalf of all the range of European positions, because they're the national positions, and increasingly there's a separate community or EU position, and then beyond that you have the non-EU members in Europe and beyond. The things that have been mentioned were certainly the hallmarks of changes in views toward the United States. Emerging in the 80s, there was a strong sense of alliance. As the Soviet Union disintegrated and changed the political environment, there were different approaches to how to deal with this, particularly with regards to Russia. And that led to a significant, I would say, practically méfiance, as they say in French. It's a little, people were wary of being led by Washington, no matter which administration it was. Then later, as the political situation in Washington complicated and changed after the Clinton administration, there was decided hostility to American leadership in certain areas, and in particular in dealing exclusively as the leader of the pack on Russia. And then, of course, China emerged later, and the European Union itself made it clear that they had different views on the way in which the Union would treat relations with China and with Russia, and finally complicated very much by the Ukraine, the war in Ukraine, where there are different views in terms of the future settlement of the war. This is discussed rather regularly and openly in Europe, and there are different views on this, which I haven't seen in the United States. But I don't follow this. It's not as if I were bird dogging it every day.
Susan, do you find yourself in your many public speeches, encounters with people, conferences you attend, and so on, do you find yourself having to remind Americans, even prominent people with considerable public responsibility and image, et cetera, that the United States should pay more attention to the rest of the world?
Well, I think we're very conscious of the world, but really from our perspective and what our interests are. I think one of the reasons we have difficulty in managing our relations with other countries, and let's face it, I think the UN vote after Russia invaded Ukraine, it was not exactly a ringing endorsement of the United States position on that. There was a big part of the global community that decided to abstain from that vote or to take a neutral position, etc. And I think we don't really understand why that is the case. We often say that the whole world is united around this, when actually it's way more complicated than that. I think some of it is how long our memory is. I mean, I hate to sort of make a joke about my own age, but I hear people on television all the time who were born well after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And it turns out I was on the barricades there at that time. And so the whole perspective about the background of that country or the background of Ukraine or the background even of the Middle East is informed more and more by young people who have come into this discussion later. If I can make one more point about Europe being better at debating these issues, I think this is really the biggest concern we have in our city here in Washington, is that there is a kind of lockdown around certain acceptable debating points. And I think that is regrettable, and we need all the pieces of the puzzle so that we can get a much richer and more in-depth view of what is really going on.
You want to elaborate on that a little bit, Susan, what some of the issues are where you find that to be the case?
Oh, I think certainly in the area of nuclear safety, I'm talking about nuclear weapons safety. If you talk, and that would be possibly whether or not any kind of tactical nuclear weapons or anything else would be used in Ukraine, or you can't really talk about that. Everybody poo-poos it. I think there are difficulties in discussing the origins of a lot of the parts of the world that we're involved in. This is why I thought the beginning of our conversation was so rich. Yes, there are definitely different global views. And if it's all right, I'd like to ask Richard to say a little bit more about the statistics of whether the United States is seen as a country that interferes in other countries' affairs, or whether we're really seen as a force for peace.
Just what I was about to do.
Yeah, oh, well, I was going to say that that's sort of the answer to my question, or the question you asked me, and that is that questioning the rights or wrongs of American policy is increasingly difficult to do here in Washington.
Mm-hmm. Yes, Susan, on your point, we had a couple of questions on a recent survey we conducted in 24 countries around the globe, where we tried to get at that a little bit. We asked people, do you think that the U.S., interferes in the politics of other countries, essentially? And people, by and large, tended to say yes. We had another question, which was, do you think the U.S. contributes to peace and stability around the world? And people tended to say yes, right? So they see a lot of things they like and don't like in terms of American foreign policy, in America more broadly. So, I think it's always a pretty complicated picture when it comes to the U.S. and American power. They see us using it at times in ways they like to sort of ensure that there's a global order and to bring some stability to the world. They don't like it all the time when we seem to be interfering in the business of other countries, however.
Mm-hmm.
I want to follow up on a couple of points with you, Richard. One is, if I'm reading it correctly, actually 82% of the people in your survey in June, or that you released in June, said the United States interferes in the affairs of other countries. That's pretty high, and I think something that most Americans might deny.
Yeah. Well, yeah, a lot of Americans actually think we interfere with in the affairs of other countries as well. But it's a point that we've seen time and again, is that people sort of want to see American power used in ways they support, ways to where we use it multilaterally. But when we use it to sort of, get involved in the affairs of other countries, that's less popular. I'd say that, not as many people say that China interferes in the affairs of other countries, but many people say that as well. One thing that distinguishes China's image from ours is that other question about contributing to sort of peace and stability around the world. We ask some of these same questions we ask about the United States, we ask about China, and China is not seen by and large as contributing to peace and stability. So, there's some areas where people have some similar views about the ways that the U.S. and China act, but there's some questions we ask where people distinguish between the role they think China is playing in world affairs and the role that the United States is playing in world affairs. And I think that U.S.-China comparison is something we've tried at least to do more, to look more and more at over the last few years in our surveys.
Nirmal, if I understand correctly from prior conversations, your editors sometimes ask you to explain things that they find surprising or baffling about the United States. And I wonder if one of those is the persistent popularity of Donald Trump with a certain segment of the population, despite having 91 criminal charges against him at the moment.
Yeah, if you I mean, the perception that I get, and this is not just editors, but generally people, sort of the feedback I get is that they are surprised at this. Donald Trump had quite a lot of support among the sort of rising right wing in India, for example. He had support in Southeast Asia because he was seen as a strong leader who was finally standing up to China. So all of these perceptions are sort of born out of the history of these regions, right? And Southeast Asia has been at the center of the Cold War proxy wars, was at the center of Cold War proxy wars, so that was badly damaged. And China's reality for Southeast Asia, but Southeast Asia also wants America to be there, is looking for ways to counterbalance China. Southeast Asia does not have any illusions about China or America, but would like to get on with them all and have trade relations pretty much on parity across the board. And again, it's turning into a multipolar world. India is also a factor. So I think there was an appreciation for the sort of strongman attitude of Donald Trump vis-a-vis China, but and especially among the right wing. Again, in India, he was quite popular. Right. I also have to sometimes explain how the American system functions. Just as Americans, I find a lot of Americans don't really understand the parliamentarian system. They think that democracy means a presidential federal system. That is the be-all and end-all. This is the pinnacle of democracy. So don't quite understand the parliamentary system. The reverse is also true. And I found very rapidly when I came here and started studying and reporting on the country that it is more useful to see America as 50 different countries in political terms. But that is a perception which is difficult for people outside the region on the other side of the world to grasp the enormous scale, size, and diversity in terms of the structural diversity, systemic diversity, checks and balances, and so forth of America. It's difficult for them to really understand that, just as it's difficult for America to understand the perception of a small middle power in Southeast Asia, for example, right on China's doorstep, right? So I think there are, as Kipling, I think, famously said, we are all sort of islands shouting lies to each other across seas of misunderstanding. I often remember that. And it is these perceptions, the lens through which the countries see their places in the world and the rest of the world, that are a problem.
The crisis, if that's the right word for it, the awkward situation in the House of Representatives right now must be especially difficult to explain. I think Americans themselves are baffled by how the result will be achieved because the main contenders are seen to have serious issues that the public is uncomfortable with. How do you sustain people's confidence in the strong man when there's something like that going on?
Yeah, so the perception of America is as a very dysfunctional is of a very dysfunctional place, and a dysfunctional system, stuck in a two-party system, more or less. I mean, you have independence and all that kind of stuff, but it's basically two parties, right? So kind of stuck in there. There's also difficulty in understanding the role of the Electoral College, which is seen as some sort of sclerotic kind of system. You can't break out of the box in America. And the way we sort of reported on the drama over the speaker was not so much the daily drama and the tension and all that, which is of course played up in American media because it's huge in America. But what the significance of it is, and one of the points that emerges, of course, is Ukraine. The aid to Ukraine is a large part of the debate. So we saw it as this sort of shows us the writing on the wall. If a Republican and if a Trumpist comes into power in the White House in 2024, it is likely that aid to Ukraine will be dramatically cut, right? So we saw
That's
this
what people
as,
are assuming.
yeah. So we sort of saw this as a sort of a harbinger of that.
Michael, I want to ask you a question. I actually want to address this to everybody, but I thought I'd start with you in Europe, and it's a slightly awkward question. This enormous crisis in Israel and the Gaza Strip that emerged just a few days ago, long after we had sort of thought about doing this program and figuring what our agenda would be. I think some people believe that it's not only going to shake the prestige of Israel and the assumptions about its invulnerability or its superior intelligence system, et cetera, but will also have that same effect toward the United States, because the United States and Israel were very closely bound on intelligence matters, it seems. And it could be what happened in a day or 2 days in Israel could be seen as not only a blow for the prestige and the status of Israel, but also for the United States. Do you think that will emerge that feeling will emerge in Europe? And then after that, I'm interested in other people's feelings about this as well.
Well, I've seen that exact position in the news already, in both in Germany and in France. So the position, and for what reasons and who is behind it is not terribly clear, but it's obviously seen as a moment when an ally, a strong ally of the United States, has been attacked, and they're sort of, well, what next? Is this going to trip any kind of special support for Israel? And that the jury's out on that. It's way too early, but it's being carefully watched in terms of American support to both military and financial support to Israel. It was in the news this morning about what was being contemplated as an increase from the United States. And of course, the military deployment was also referred to. I don't know if that was true or not. But I think the final thing, and the elephant in the room a bit about this discussion, is the demise, or at least the retreat, of multilateralism. And the feeling in Europe is that, I think, largely, is multilateralism works for the United States as long as they're leading it. But if they're not leading it, then they don't want it. And they're very vocal in all of the international organizations that I've been involved with in stating that position, that they're independent, and for reasons, political reasons and historic reasons, they can't commit to larger goals or even stronger goals. So I think there's a feeling that the United States is going it alone always. And then when things go south, they try to get everybody else involved in a multilateral affair. I mean, the Iraq War was an example of this, was ridiculed for this. And the recent performance of the United Nations is miserable.
That's not a news story, unfortunately.
No.
Richard, obviously, I doubt you've had a survey in the field since Saturday at this point on this matter, but do you see the Israel situation as a potential, doing some potential harm to the United States in one way or another?
I don't know. I'd be pretty cautious about predicting one way or another how this might affect how people think about the United States. I mean, I think it'll depend a lot on what happens over the next several weeks and months, and to the extent to which partners to address this crisis. Because I agree with what Michael said, that the kind of bigger pattern in terms of what we're seeing when it comes to how people think about the United States is how much is it seen as contributing to multilateral efforts or not, or does it only do it on its own terms? I think it's a long-standing criticism of the United States that we've seen in the past, and there are a lot of questions, as you say, about the effectiveness of the multilateral system. We ask about something like climate change, which is a big concern in many countries around the world, and people are very pessimistic that the international system, in the multilateral system, is going to be able to deal with a question like that, with an issue like that. So, I think this overall issue of how much the United States can work together with other nations to solve big crises and big challenges is one that's going to be very important. The only thing I would say on that front is we have seen a little bit of positive movement in our most recent polling. There's the question we've been asking for a long time about whether you think the United States listens to countries like you, essentially, when it's making foreign policy decisions. It's a big criticism people have had for a very long time of the United States, that we just ignore the interest of other countries. That view is still pretty widespread, but it's moved in a positive direction over the last few years. People are becoming more likely than they have in the past, at least, to say, we think that the United States does take our interest into account when it's making decisions about policy. So, on that front of collaboration, we've seen a little bit in terms of positive signs in our polling over the last couple of years.
Susan, I wonder if you could address this issue of the effect of the crisis in Israel and Gaza, perhaps on assumptions about the United States. And then I also want to ask you about the decline of the two political parties and in the U.S. and how that complicates the outside view of America, the decline in predictability.
Well, thanks, Sandy, for that question. I'm with the panel. I think it's a little too soon to tell about how America is going to be evaluated in the face of what happened in Israel. It just depends a lot on how we handle the situation. So I would put that to the side. But I do think in terms of, to the extent that there is loss of confidence in the United States and this question around our kind of crazy, complicated system, I think that there are a couple of things that are worth mentioning. First of all, Americans are suffering from the same thing people around the globe are suffering from, which is this extraordinary rapid change that's underway in terms of inflation, now the prospect of artificial intelligence, a very bad summer that has brought the whole issue of climate change to home. Everybody around the world is now beginning to say, oh my gosh, and we're behind in our work to mitigate that. And so there's this kind of longing for stability where, in fact, the predominant emotion is anxiety. I hear this all the time in my travels, anxiety around the future. So I think in terms of what's happening in this country, that's I have not seen it reported nearly enough, and that is that in March, Gallup poll came out with their study that today there are more Americans that identify as independent voters than Democrats and Republicans combined. Now, this is a very large part of the population who is, in some sense, disenfranchised, certainly from the primary system in most states. And this is a huge swing vote. So I would say not only is the America's reputation tied to Israel and what the outcome of that's going to be is one factor that's too soon to tell. I would also say the upcoming election, given all of the hiccups we've had along the way, and we could certainly go into those on a specific level, but I'll just leave it there. This huge, huge group of independent voters with now a third-party candidate in the mix, I think it's too soon to tell about that too. And so the world is going to be looking at us with both hope and fear, along with a lot of other Americans too, I'll say.
Could I ask you to take out your crystal ball for a moment, Susan, and answer a question that I've heard increasingly in recent weeks? Do you think that both Joe Biden and Donald Trump will actually be on the ballot next year for the presidency?
Well, I gave up crystal balls after I predicted the collapse of the Soviet Union before the American government did. But if I were to look at some tea leaves now, we haven't tried the tea leaves.
Better.
Yeah. No, I think that there others who've done polling, I think the number was 78% that I saw, would like both of them to exit the scene. Now, we all know, and some of you here are more expert at this than I am, but there's only a certain amount of time left for other candidates to emerge in this process, which is where, again, the presence of a third-party candidate gets really interesting. So I think it's the feeling that the kind of change that's underway right now is that the stakeholders need more power around the decisions that are made that are going to be impacting their lives, as opposed to the older members of our group of elected officials.
Irma, I wonder if you could bring us around to the question of how all this is being covered, not only internationally, but in the United States. Is there, I mean, we are concerned, obviously, my particular project, as you all know, is the Free Speech Project. And the big part of that is free press. And does the press speak freely? Does it speak originally? And does it dare raise questions, as Susan suggested earlier, that often it seems the mainstream media don't? So if you were to put on a hat as a kind of media critic about the role, reporting on the role of the United States, how's everybody doing?
I think I have actually become more critical of the U.S. media. I think the U.S. media is, of course, among the freest in the world, not the freest, but among the freest. But it sees the world through an American lens. Very few don't do that. Very few are able to step out of that box. And I'll give you a practical example without naming names. It was a big liberal international channel interviewed, host was interviewing the Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, a couple of years ago. And the host used the word punish 4 times. I counted it. I went back to the transcript and checked. In the context of, should we punish China? Should we punish Iran? Should we punish, I think it was North Korea? And so 4 times the host, and the Secretary of State did not use the word. He's a diplomat, right? And a very good one. But the host used that word punish, and the royal we as well, should we punish? And that was disappointing, because that is what grates on the rest of the world, that American media sees the rest of the world through that lens, that the rest of the world is essentially like, an American, it's an American world. And I think it was a friend of mine, Cynthia Watson, a former dean of National War College, who told me just the other day, she put my thoughts into words. She said, Americans have a tendency to see the world as a problem that needs to be fixed. And once it's fixed, everything is going to be okay. We will have stability. Whereas a lot of the rest of the world goes around problems. The view is not black or white. You sweep a problem under the carpet, you go around it, you live with it, you live with a paradox. You can live with the paradox of Taiwan, for example. So it is these cultural differences, I think, which are very important. And the media, the American mainstream media, certainly reflects an American, the American point of view and the sort of Washington blob consensus. And you see that on Ukraine. Anybody trying to analyze the Ukraine invasion in a sort of dispassionate manner was immediately labeled an apologist for Putin. Anybody trying to explain China is immediately labeled a Chinese apologist. So there's a very black and white binary view. And this goes into millions of American living rooms 24/7, depending on a few differences domestically, depending on which channel you're watching. But in terms of foreign policy, it's pretty much the same, I would say. That is the view that is projected.
I just picking up on that point quickly. The other evening, I heard something on an alternative radio channel that has been around for a long time but doesn't have a huge audience that was claiming that, well, I shouldn't say claiming, making the argument that the mainstream American media seemed to be thumping for a new Cold War with China, that they were interpreting every event, large and small, as evidence that we're going to be we in the United States are going to be in a major confrontation with China, which is a pretty frightening prospect to make an assumption of American foreign policy or American life. And I hadn't quite seen it that way until I heard this alternative perspective that evening.
Yeah.
Richard, I'm sorry. Yes, go ahead, Nirmal.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt, but you're spot on, and that program is spot on. Essentially, there is if you look at the language of say the national security analyst community in the States and the media, there's an assumption that they are going to war eventually with China. So there's this assumption, and this is not without grounds, that China is preparing for war. China is addressing its vulnerabilities in terms of its food grains, wheat stockpile, and so on and so forth. The way it's doing, the way it's arranging everything, it is preparing for war. And so the two sides are actually mirror imaging each other, and it's in this sort of very ominous choreography, if you will, which I'm not very. No, I don't think you'll find very many people optimistic about them being able to avoid a war. And the media is very much a part of it. If you watch some of the mainstream media, it's as if, China is an existential threat, China is the enemy. The word enemy is bandied about with great abandon, right? And people believe it because they're consuming this all the time.
We're going to go in just a second back to Mike Scott to handle some of the questions that have come from our participants online. But Richard, before we do that, do you hear anything in all of this that implies you might have to sort of do your business a little differently and ask slightly different questions in the future? This is just speculation on my part.
Yeah, well, it's always a challenge, right, to ask people these questions about, the changing international order and these big trends in foreign affairs, because we bug them at dinner time, right, and start asking them all these questions. That those kind of issues might not be top of mind, but in general, we have seen that people are pretty aware of these broad trends, right? They do see, things changing in terms of the balance of power around the world. They are, interested and care a lot about international threats. So, I think that, continuing to sort of examine how people see global challenges and threats and problems evolving is part of what we need to do. And we need to think about, not only asking questions about the U.S. and China, but maybe more about rising powers like India and things like that, right? So trying to take into account an emerging, more complicated world is part of what we have to do in our surveys.
Michael Oborn, any
Yes.
thoughts about different questions arising now?
I think that yes, they definitely are already bubbling up. The one of the questions I think that I've seen recently is why don't Americans inside the United States discuss different issues more openly and more divisively? And there, of course, the voices that are saying this in Europe are looking for support for their view. And it could be about economics, it could be about immigration, it could be about current conflicts. But I think the jury is out on whether this is going to lead in the immediate future up to the election to a strong change of view. The independent road that the United States has taken multilaterally, and the poor chance of getting support from a European country if they have a difference of view from the United States.
Okay, I think we'll go to Mike Scott and see what he's got from the listeners and participants from outside, and proceed that part of the program. Mike?
Hi, well, thank you. Thank you for interesting discussion so far. There's some interesting questions in as well. This one comes from Katie Nick. With the ongoing rise of authoritarianism around the world, does the strongman, in inverted commas, identity of Trump and the American far-right movement create a perception that the United States is more closely related or allied with authoritarian countries? Susan?
Well, all I know is that that's what the news media tells us. I don't know. Perhaps some of our other panelists can answer that question. I think anybody could look at the political statistics and see that Trump has enormous support within the Republican Party, but certainly not necessarily by any means among independents or Democrats. So, the figures look pretty tight in the presidential race, having said that. But whether or not they see, the United States turning towards a more dictatorial country, again, that's one of the great mysteries that we're going to have to see play out as this election does. I do think on this subject more broadly, that America's image could change and shift quite dramatically between the war between Ukraine and Russia and what's happened in the Middle East, and a very, very contentious political situation inside our own country. This is a highly dynamic set of circumstances that could change quite dramatically, and public opinion could reflect that, I think, rather rapidly.
Richard?
Yeah, well, absolutely. In terms of, potential changes in U.S. image, when Trump was elected, it led to a sharp downturn in ratings for the United States, following his election. So, certainly that'll be a big issue of the next year, right? What happens with the presidential election? I mean, on this question of is the U.S. seen as being more authoritarian? I mean, we haven't asked that directly in our surveys. We have asked about perceptions of the health of American democracy, and it's clear that people around the world see the U.S. having serious problems right now in many ways with the health of its democracy. They see us as being very divided along partisan lines. There's a question we ask where we ask people: is the U.S. a good example of democracy for other countries to follow? Did it used to be a good example, but isn't any longer, or has it never been a good example for other countries to follow? And the most common response in the countries where we do the survey is that the U.S. used to be a good example, but isn't today. So there's this view that there really is a problem with the health of American democracy that's a bit new and it's getting worse. And most Americans share that view, right? This is something that's part of America's global image, but it's an assessment of American democracy that most Americans agree with too. So, here you see both Americans and people around the world right now have real questions about the direction of American democracy.
Michael, from a Parisian point of view, what do you think about this authoritarianism?
Well, the track record isn't good, either for the European countries or the United States. I mean, obviously, there are internal issues now in the United States, as have just been mentioned, that tend to present the American situation as tending toward concentration of powers. Although at the same time, there was in the British and the French, British, and Italian press recently, there was a survey that was presented in which they explained that half of the United States people interviewed could not name two of the three branches of government. And then they went beyond this and said even further percentage couldn't name any of them. And then the tenor of the argument was, this is the prelude to a strong man government, because it means people are stepping back from the democratic model, which requires engagement and painful and discussive interaction between citizens. So this image came out, and it was commented on the television, because they were, of course, turned it inward and said, well, how many citizens of our countries could describe the political system of our country? So I think there's an admiration and a repulsion for strongman government position, but at the same time, it's in the cards. It's one of the choices.
Well, you were kind of nodding there. Did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I mean, going back to the question, it does create a perception that the US is, I would say, more. If the US veers more right, which it is actually doing, if it sort of continues on that path, there is and will be a perception that it is similar to other authoritarian governments, not allied. I mean, the question also said allied, but that's a different matter. That wouldn't be the case. But say if the US continues on this path through 24 and the next election, you will actually have potentially authoritarian governments, authoritarian people in charge of the largest economies in the world. China, India, Narendra Modi is widely seen as authoritarian, and the US might well join them, and with that would have a lot in common as well with other leaders. Some in Europe as well. There are strong right-wing movements in unexpected places in Europe. Really, it's kind of disconcerting that it's such a slippery slope, isn't it? That populations can veer towards this kind of in that direction so easily, and it does reflect a disillusionment with democratic processes, the dysfunction and discomfort of a free democracy, and it also reflects a sort of which is a streak in human societies everywhere, really, and we've seen it, obviously, a sort of mild sort of infatuation with the idea of a daddy state, or an authoritarian state who takes care of everything, makes everything work, and sometimes they come to power often they come to power through a democratic process, as we've seen, right? So there's a very thin line.
Yeah, absolutely.
Michael, may I add a point here?
Yeah, please
I
do.
think some of this ambivalence revolves around certainly a feeling in the United States, but also, I'm sure, in other countries around the world. And that is a loss of control. This loss of control is very intensely felt in this country. And I think the public feels it very strongly because, as we said earlier, there is all of this discussion on television about the inevitable war with China. And a lot of people are saying to themselves, why is it inevitable? I mean, what do we have the State Department for? Can't we find some solutions before we get to that stage? So the fact that we don't feel like we're being heard makes us feel like we're losing control. Then the rapidly changing international environment makes us feel like we're losing control. And so people look for remedies just to feel more balanced, to feel like they can avert their attention for a few minutes while they take care of other things.
And can I jump in with a couple of quick points? I mean, to endorse what Susan said, very, very pertinent point about, if you could look back, I think it was 1971, 72. When was it? WTO in Seattle. There were 1 million people in the streets protesting against it, right? There were millions of people in the streets in European cities and American cities protesting against the invasion of Iraq. There were millions of people on the streets protesting about fossil fuels. Pretty much, they were pretty much ignored. And the fallout politically in the US came more than a couple of decades later, when the middle America, the sort of disused factory towns, all those populations, they came back, they fought back through the election. Iraq was a disaster. So, unfortunately, the people are not really listened to. And I think that contributes to this feeling that we're not in control.
Is this to do with the news media? There's something that occurred just a few weeks ago, which was reported in the Parisian papers, actually, and on French television, that there was a huge demonstration in London to try and get Britain back into Europe. The BBC didn't put it on. They didn't show it at all. It wasn't in the papers. It was in France's papers, but it wasn't in the UK's papers. So the media has the media got a real responsibility here to be neutral. And is the media neutral? Michael?
Well, no, the media is not neutral in my view, but it's not supposed to be. I mean, it's obviously coming from a voice within a society. It's the idea that it's the truth and nothing but the truth, I think, is not an accepted view of the media. But one thing I wanted to mention is this idea of an inevitable war with China, which is much more prevalent in the United States, I think, than in Europe, is an ironic position because China itself, traditionally, the empire and China as up through the present day, has not been aggressive in the same way the United States has. And they don't rattle the swords anywhere near as much. So it's odd that everybody is signing up to this inevitability.
Yeah. Okay. Let me go to a question from Jeannie Michelin, who says, they both, Trump and Biden, will absolutely be on the ballot. I think the question is, who will win? And as of now, it looks like Trump will defeat Biden, as Biden has not been a strong president and has failed to address and resolve the issues in Ukraine and now with Israel. Let me preface this by saying that I am not a fan of Trump, but America needs strength right now, and under this current administration, we are looking very weak. Susan?
Well, I think that it certainly looks like it's going to be both of these individuals, but we can hope, right? We can hope that I don't understand actually why the Democrats are suppressing the opportunity for the president to be able to make his case in this campaign. There's no danger in having any opposition. There's an opportunity for him to show that he is despite his age, up to this job. So as things go, it may lump along in that direction. But I think that especially young people who do not understand why we're in a period of competition, when in fact all the things that are going to save this planet require cooperation. And they're the ones that are the stakeholders. So I think you're going to see a lot of unhappiness around young people in this campaign.
Normal?
Yeah. I think I wrote a story, in fact, just the other day, that it's looking increasingly inevitable that both Joe Biden and Donald Trump will be on the ballot. Although all the surveys that we mentioned, in fact, say that majority of Americans don't want that kind of race. I think America is sort of stuck in Ukraine and in the Middle East with its fixed positions. And if Trump happens to win, now giant caveat there, because what will determine the outcome of the election next year is obviously probably hasn't happened yet. It could be another war, could be anything, a recession or anything. But another caveat is that the conventional wisdom is that Donald Trump's base is fiercely loyal but too narrow to carry a national election. So he will need a lot of those swing voters, and there's no indication that he's going to get them, enough of them. Having said that, if he gets into office, into the White House in 2024, he has a propensity to take sort of out-of-the-box decisive actions, unconventional out-of-the-box decisive actions. And it is possible that he will do that with Ukraine. In fact, it's probable that he will do that with Ukraine. He will somehow, he has said, I'll end the war in 24 hours. Of course, typical Trump hyperbole, but Israel is more difficult because, as we know, Israel is non-negotiable for the US. So it's going to be tough, very, very, very tough.
Sue Osler kind of changes the direction a little bit in a question that says, is it true that people who donate huge amounts to a political US party allows them to dictate what questions should be raised in Senate? I think there's another question there goes back to, can you still go from a log cabin to the White House in the US? Is it that money is running everything now in the US and that democracy isn't? Susan?
Well, I would just say that money plays a big role in politics. There's no question about it, and especially, the dark money that now is legal. But I mean, this is back to where, democracies have to be vital. You can spend a lot of money on a candidate, and if that candidate isn't any good, all the money in the world isn't going to help them. So I think the public, this is a case that the public should take very seriously, demand political finance reform, and to make sure that they go out and vote. What disturbs me is I hear 2 nights ago a friend of mine was saying, just turn off the TV, have a nice life, who needs this? Well, if this is going to be the general public reaction, money will probably decide an awful lot.
Mike, may I put in 2 cents here?
Yes, Andy.
Yeah. I think we've known about dark money for quite some time, and about some of the dangers of unlimited political contributions, et cetera, and what it's done to the system. What's new in the past 6 months or so is that yet one more institution of the much vaunted American democracy has been revealed to be influenced by donors to the justices of the Supreme Court. And that is profoundly troubling. That seemed to be when chaos was around us and everything was falling apart, no Speaker of the House of Representatives, et cetera, we could always rely on the wise justices of the Supreme Court. And I think that many of us have had to give pause to that thought and wonder, how will we reform the Supreme Court so that some of its extraordinarily important decisions are not influenced by the equivalent of political contributions?
Yeah. Well, as I've said before, Sandy, it's one of the 4 pillars of democracy is the independence of the judiciary.
Of
The
course.
autonomy of the university is another. Freedom of the press and the free election of the parliament. Those are the four pillars. If one of those pillars is being controlled by another, then democracy has got a problem.
You're the John Stuart Mill of our era, Mike.
I tell you what, though, and quite seriously, and I think Nirmal mentioned it, but I mean, I grew up, I was born just after the Second World War. My eldest brother was born during the Blitz on Coventry in the Second World War. I grew up with that. I grew up also with the fact of the First World War because my relations had been in the First World War. And my father used to say, remember that Hitler got in through the ballot box. And he did. And I think that's the warning. And I think that's a kind of a fear that's going around the world at the moment about what is happening in the United States and what's going to happen over the next year. There's one other question that came in. Is it useful for Russia that the US attention is being directed away from the war with Ukraine to the difficulties over Gaza? Anybody want to take that? Or do you want to remain silent?
I think
as we come to the end of the show?
Short answer is yes.
Yes.
I think my answer would be it depends on how long the situation in Gaza is the sole subject for the news media, because attention could turn back at any moment too.
Yeah. It's what you're saying, Susan, that it's the media, but not the government. The government is able to handle the two things together.
Well, I would add one thing very quickly, is that an issue that might emerge is that we're going to be sending military supplies and other things to Israel. At the same time, we've told Ukraine we've run out. And so I think that is going to create some pressure, and a lot more pressure coming from those in that part of the world who are relying on our protection. So I think these may end up being quite interlocked in some fashion.
Yeah, thank you. Final word from you, Michael?
No, but just to remark that what we've been talking about is what's in the air here. To a large extent, people are now viewing the future of democracy as a collection of advocacy groups who are deciding the political future of countries, and not so much the individual citizens at the bottom. And of course, the political parties have been disintermediated from much of the political system in Europe. So I think it's another model. It's another grouping of a democratic process where strong viewed individuals can organize groups, finance them, and have their voice heard beyond their numeric weight.
Thank you. Richard, is any of that going to materialize in another questionnaire going out from you?
Yeah, I mean, these questions about trajectory of democracy, I think, are really important to us, and the kind of thing we want to look at in our surveys. I mean, what we see in our surveys around the world is often that democracy remains a pretty popular idea. Ask people about representative democracy, and they think it's a good way to govern their country. But the problem is that they're not as committed to democratic values as we might think or hope, right? Some of those same people who say democracy is a good idea are also open to a strong leader model, or even open to military rule, right? So that lack of commitment to democracy opens up opportunities for authoritarians to take advantage of. And it's all exacerbated by things like polarization too, right? What happens sometimes is that people become so concerned about the other side winning power, they're willing to trade off some of their democratic values in order to keep their opponents out of power, right? So, democracy, you ask people about it, they'll say it's a good thing, but you got to probe a little deeper to see how committed they are to democratic institutions and to democratic values.
Well, thank you all very much. I'm going to hand back to Sandy, and then he'll come back to me. Is there anything else, Sandy, you want to say?
No, I think we're okay, Mike. I just briefly want to thank everyone for participating. This discussion went in some slightly different directions from what we might have expected, but I think to everyone's credit and to we got beyond the cliches, explored some truly uncertainty principles that we're faced with. So I want to thank my colleague Mike Scott, 35 programs now, amazingly, and thank Georgetown University, key people here who have supported these programs and the Free Speech Project generally, which is growing and growing. freespeechproject.georgetown.edu, well over 800 incidents tracked of challenges to free speech in the United States in the last few years at this point. And thank you all for giving us your time. And thanks to Mike.
Well, thank you, Sandy. And again, my thanks to Michael Oborne, Susan Einhauer, Normal Gosh, and Richard Wake. And I'm very, very grateful for what has been a sobered discussion. It didn't go the way we thought, and I hope that a lot of people will look at this and the recorded version of this, because some very important things are being said. The next Free Speech Project at a Crossroads International Dialogues and event in association with the Future of the Humanities Project will be on Wednesday, the 15th of November, when we will be discussing how free is the press in Europe. So we moved from the United States to Europe. We did Britain just a few weeks ago. I'd like to announce also that there's a new series starting on cultural encounters, books that have made a difference. And that starts on Monday, the 23rd of October at 7 p.m. UK time, but 2 p.m. EST, when one of the most renowned literary critics and philosophers of our generation, Terry Eagleton, will be discussing the New Testament in its cultural confrontation with the Roman Empire. Now, if Terry Eagleton's going to be discussing that, I can assure you that it's going to be a contemporary issue for us all. So please join us for that. That's a terrific talk that we're going to get. It's 7 p.m. UK time, 2 p.m. EST on Monday, the 23rd of October. My thanks to colleagues at Georgetown, to President Jack DeGioia, and I was pleased to be over in Georgetown recently and met with the president, and again he was fully behind these series that we're running. Vice President Global Affairs Tom Banchoff at Blackfriars, to John O'Connor, the Regent, Richard Finn, the Director of Las Casas Institute, and our new prior, whose name is Nick Crow. Campion Hall to Dr. Nick Austin, SJ. My thanks to John McCabe, our colleague at Georgetown, who administers all of this, to Laura Lees, my UK publicist, and also to my wife Maggie, who does so much of the administration. I couldn't do it without her. Thank you all today for your support of our various series, and thanks especially to Sandy. I'm Professor Mike Scott, Fellow and Senior Dean at Blackfriars Hall, Oxford. You can follow me on X, as it is now. It used to be Twitter, but on X at Mike Scott Prof. Until next time, take care, keep safe. Thanks again, everybody.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Thank you very much.
Everyone.
All the best.